So Bernardine, we're on the cusp of the Article 50 notice being issued next week. You lead our European and antitrust team. You've lived in Brussels. I imagine you're very excited about Brexit.
Quite. What's going to happen next is the letter will probably be quite short, 2 pages. And what will happen is governed by Article 50 of the EU treaty. So very much Europe is a creature of law. It has to follow this particular procedure. So the Council of Ministers, which is the political arm representing the 27 member states, will give a negotiating mandate to the European Commission, which is the civil service. So the council's going to have to meet up. That will take 5 to 6 weeks for them to determine, work out between themselves what that mandate should comprise. And then we will be off, so possibly from early June, starting the hard negotiation. Everybody seems to assume there's this long stop date of Article 50. In fact, that can be extended if all member states, including the United Kingdom, agree to an extension. But otherwise, the Commission and the Council are looking at a very tight timetable. They want this to be done and dusted and over by October 2018 in order to give it 6 months to get the European Parliament. So we're talking 18 months maximum in terms of negotiating space at the moment.
And is that just to negotiate one agreement, a withdrawal arrangement, or what? What do you think?
Yeah, there are obviously different views as to how many agreements should be concluded. From a EU perspective, it's going to be quite tight, quite limited to the Article 50 exit agreement, which is basically, thank you, close the door after you. The Article 50 does envisage that within that exit agreement there will be an arrangement as to the framework of the future arrangement. But that could be very loose. It could be a page, it could be a picture. It doesn't have to be very much at all. Also a transitional arrangement as to how the different economies migrate towards the new regime of the UK being outside of it. The UK is now looking also at the possibility of a free trade agreement. But that won't necessarily happen because there's so many demands we're putting on the table around immigration, for example, and we don't want to be bound by the European Court of Justice. Query whether a free trade agreement is possible. And then the UK government is also saying they would like a specific customs arrangement. So those 2 last agreements are still very much up in the air as to whether they're achievable and achievable in any reasonable time frame.
So if we get to the 2-year mark, we don't agree to extend it, we failed to enter into any of these agreements, what happens then?
Well, under the Article 50 says the treaty ceased to apply to the United Kingdom. So we essentially crash out of the EU. At the moment, everyone's talking about this bill, the big bill around that Britain will be on the hook for about £60 billion. How does that arise? That arises because we set the budget. The EU agrees the budget in 6-year periods. So at the moment, we've got a set budget for 2014 to 2020. So obviously they're saying, well, the UK is on the hook for those budgetary payments for that time. However, if we crash out of the EU, Article 50 says the treaties no longer apply, so therefore query whether we are actually on the hook to make those payments.
But I imagine we wouldn't be very popular for future relations if we
Correct.
don't contribute.
And actually that's a very unpalatable position for the United Kingdom to be maintaining. So clearly there's going to be a negotiation as to what are we willing to pay to keep everybody sweet, and what do we get in return. But clearly there are limits to what we can get in return because it's a very strong consensus that Britain should not be in a better position outside of the EU than it is within the EU.
And of course, the membership of the EU, common market, single market, and all those kinds of those core things. But there are lots of other arrangements out there, research and other flanking arrangements.
Correct.
Where do they all fit into this?
Well, at the moment, there's a certain lack of reality, as other people are saying, in the EU as to the current UK position. Because yes, you have the fundamental 4 freedoms, freedom of movement of people, of goods, of services, and of capital. Around that are these things called horizontal or flanking measures, really to secure in the disparate local economies, national economies of the member states. So you have the cohesion funds to bring on the poorer areas of Europe. And the United Kingdom has benefited from it. Northern Ireland, other deprived areas, parts of Wales, for example, has been a net beneficiary over the years. R&D projects to have across-EU collaboration in industrial projects, in pharma industry is going to be a net loser in that respect as well. And so at the moment, the UK and United Kingdom government is saying, yes, we will no longer be on the hook for this and these massive budgetary payments, but we will pay. We'd quite like access to these flanking horizontal arrangements. Whereas the rest of Europe are saying, no, you are not a willing member of the European project, moving everybody towards a solid democracy, a single economy across the board, moving towards, quite frankly, the end game is a federal Europe. If you're not part party to that project, to the European Court of Justice, to the Four Freedoms, you cannot benefit from these. You cannot be in or out and cherry pick those particular projects.
Okay. So hopefully some form of agreement is reached, because there's lots of reasons why for everyone we'd reach some form of agreement. May not be the agreement our government wants, but hopefully we reach some kind of agreement. Does it require every member of the EU to agree to their side to it?
What is quite interesting about Article 50, it applies for the agreement shall be decided upon by the Council of Ministers on the basis of what we call qualified majority voting. So that means we don't quite know how it's going to be weighted out, because the UK is no longer in the weighting anymore. So loosely speaking, it's probably about 20 of the member states can vote in favour out of the 27 and get this through. So not everybody has to sign up to it. I think politically they're going to try and get complete consensus, but it's not necessary.
Okay, but if the agreement becomes more complex, which it could well do, is deals are done on the flanking arrangements perhaps while would that still be subject to qualified majority voting?
One of the sort of fault lines in terms of the development of Europe at the moment is this distinction between what can the EU agree, which is within any Article 50 arrangement, an exit agreement, that falls within the exclusive competence of the EU, the collectivity of these 27 member states, and areas that still fall within the competence of the national member states. And that is, quite frankly, quite difficult to delineate, and we've had a number of court cases on that question. So from an EU perspective, the simpler they can make the deal, the more they very much keep it within the tram lines of exclusive competence, the simpler it will be to get through. If it gets more complex and starts to have other areas that arguably bleed over into areas of national competence, obviously you're going to need ratification from the national parliaments, all of which is going to take longer time and be a much more febrile situation.
Right, so that will drive us towards a simple, narrow arrangement just because that's more possible.
Correct, that's the legal position, but we may find politically that all the various national parliaments are saying this is such an important issue. Nonetheless, irrespective of the Article 50 position, we would like to be consulted, we want to be kept in the loop, we want to know what's happening here, and we want to give our approval.
Okay, so that sort of sets out the sort of legal, political landscape in terms of how the Article 50 would work, the negotiations and potential outputs. But just turning, you talked about how do the national parliaments think. Well, what is the sense amongst the rest of Europe to Brexit? What was their reaction to this?
I think it's like in Britain, it's a grieving process. But there's no denying that the Brexit is a crisis for Europe. But what is happening is that I don't think people quite fully appreciate this is not the only game in town in terms of crises facing the EU. You've got the immigration issue, you've got the uncertainty of what's happening in the US. All of these are big issues. You've got issues around defence as well. And what it's leading to is very much Europe is saying this is a crisis. We have to look to ourselves and ask, well, what went wrong here? How do we have to shape and reshape things moving forward? And as ever, a lot of this is happening around the issue of budget and money, because now there is going to be, moving forward, a 7% gap in the European budget. A lot of member states are reluctant to pay more. Those who are willing perhaps to pay more are going to say, okay, we need to have a wholesale reform around how we do things, how we are engaging with our own populace to have engagement by the citizenship, which currently there is clearly a sense that that's not happened. And Europe is now, the EU is basically very much on a project to address these issues. The Commission has produced a white paper looking at the various scenarios moving forward. We've had a declaration from the French, German, Italian, Spanish leaders saying we now want to have a multi-speed Europe. The EU is moving towards what Britain always wanted, ironically, as we leave. So there's a big thought process going through. A number of papers are going to be coming through at the same time as we are negotiating. So we're basically negotiating with, it's like the speeding wagon that's changing, sort of Medusa-like, changing form and shape as the negotiations take place. And don't forget also we've got the national elections at the same time, so we may be differing, the seats may be differing with whom our counterparties are in the Council of Ministers.
Yes, of course, because we've had the Dutch election, but we've got France and Germany and Italy, I think,
Italy,
as well.
yes, the Czech Republic as well, yes.
Right, so we have a whole series of national elections going on in the backdrop to this.
That's right. And there's also a tension emerging between the richer, more established EU member states and the Visegrad countries, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland. They are feeling very uncomfortable about a multi-speed Europe. They're saying we'll become second-class citizens in the EU because they're net beneficiaries from the EU budget, and they're worried they're going to be sort of pushed to one side while the richer member states move forward more towards federalism and integration.
So Bernadine, one of the ambitions of the UK government is to enter a free trade agreement with the EU. How do you see that shaping up?
That may be problematic. There is a very, very firm desire, expressed desire on the part of the EU, I think led us particularly by the French, is that Britain should not be better off outside the EU than inside the EU. And so you come back to this notion of the fundamental four freedoms. So very much the thinking is if you don't sign up to every single one of those four freedoms, including a particular free movement of persons, you cannot benefit from a free trade agreement. So I think we're being naive to think, oh, well, we can do something like the Canadians did. That's, I think, because our acquis communautaire, we say, the body of community laws, that is already in our laws already. So I think it may well be a stretch if we get a complete free trade agreement, because we're setting out our stall saying we want a block on immigration, and also we refuse to have the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Straight away, that paints us into a corner and limits what we can achieve in terms of a free trade agreement. The other thing we have to bear in mind is the WTO. So Theresa May has said we'd like a bit of preference for certain sectors, for example, the car sector. Again, the noises from Europe and other member states are clearly, it's like, no, unless you sign up to the fundamental four freedoms, which you refused. We gave you, under the Tusk project, we gave you some flexibility around free movement of workers, which you rejected. Until such time as you don't do that, all bets are off. So we can't very well have a comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU, so we cannot cherry pick, one, because it's against fundamental four freedoms, and two, because the WTO rules won't let us. Because if we have that sweet deal with the rest of the EU, we must do similar sweet deals with the rest of the world under the WTO most favoured nation clauses.
So we may well end up with no or limited free trade agreement with the EU.
I think that is possible, given the current uncompromising position we're in. I mean, it's a lovely idea to think we can have what we would call a UKITA, United Kingdom Economic European Free Trade Agreements. But I think, given the differences in views and difference in positions currently, it is going to be a long shot to get that.
And then another issue that's been talked about in the context of EU law is our ability as the UK to go and negotiate free trade agreements or other trade agreements with non-EU countries, Australia, New Zealand, the US, and people say we're not allowed to do that. Is that true?
Yes and no. There is a fundamental constitutional principle of the European Union that a member state should not do anything to interfere or compromise the objectives of the European Union. And obviously that would necessarily include you can't agree, you don't have the competence to agree a trade agreement with a third country. But here we're talking about initial exploratory talks. So I think it's a stretch to say we'd be in breach of that constitutional principle, which is a treaty article. And also at the end of the day, if the European Union wanted to chase after Britain for breach of its constitutional commitment to the rest of the EU, it's going to be out of time. And realistically, so many of these third countries are saying, yes, we want to talk. Can we just wait and see what shape and size the United Kingdom is going to have in its relationship with the rest of the EU, and then we'll start to talk Turkey.
Right. So that's the real politic of this, isn't it? Is that
yes.
Other third-party countries are going to hesitate to do a deal until they see the shape of whatever our future EU deal is.
Correct.
Why waste time
Yeah.
on something? But equally, if you're those governments or the UK governments, you probably are having exploratory talks about what in principle a deal might be.
Yes.
To sort of warm up, but they're not going to do any real deals.
That's correct, because they're not quite sure what's going to be on offer.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much, Bernadine.
Pleasure.